Good evening, everyone, and welcome to InsideIndieGames, the series where we delve inside independent games and the developers who create them. I'd like to welcome all of you in the audience to tonight's episode. We're very excited to introduce tonight's guest. He is the co-founder of RadicalFishGames. He is a programmer, artist, and also designer for CrossCode, a very exciting action RPG experience that is now available on Steam. I believe it's been available on Steam since May of 2015. If there's anyone in the audience that hasn't had the chance to play this, my advice is go play it, or at the very least try the demo. Hardcore Gamer calls it a game that will renew your faith in indie video games, and Rock Paper Shotgun says it's the best demo they've ever played for a currently crowdfunded project. Felix, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, what did you tell us where you're based?
I'm based in Saarbrücken, Germany. So that's one city somewhere on the west side of Germany, right next to France. So you could essentially almost walk to France. It's that close to the border. And that's where I'm living. That's where I studied, and that's where I'm still now living, working on CrossCode.
Is that where you grew up?
Not exactly. I actually grew up in another part in Germany. That is Essen. That is more to the north a bit. It's a very crowded place in Germany. A lot of cities close by, Nordrhein-Westfalen, and that's where I grew up. And I went to school, but then I decided to study in Saarbrücken, and that's when I moved.
Well, how does Saarbrücken kind of compare with where you grew up?
Oh, it's city is not that big. I mean, it's the largest city in that area, in this Bundesstaat, which is Saarland. But Saarland is a pretty small Bundesstaat, so there's barely anything in there. It's just the biggest city in the smallest state, so to say. It's a good place to live. Rent is not too expensive. You have everything you need close by, so it's rather nice, I would say.
How much time does it take for you to visit home when you need to?
It's actually just a 4 to 5 hours train ride, I would say. In the end, Germany isn't that big, so that's why you can travel to other places by train, so it's not such a big deal.
So in your hometown, that's where your immediate family is right now?
That's true, yeah. They're still there.
Do you have siblings as well?
I got a brother. He's still living close to our hometown now, somewhere.
Is he also kind of involved in games or computers?
Not so much. He's essentially working on. He's kind of involved with IT companies, as far as I know. I'm actually not 100% sure myself, but he's not much involved in video game development. But he plays games. He's actually more a fan of strategy games. But he also played CrossCode, and he kind of follows our development. Also pretty excited about how things are developing in general.
How about your folks, your mother and father? Are they also in computers?
That's actually an interesting part, because my father is actually, he's not so much involved in game development or games in general. He doesn't play anything at all, I think, in terms of video games. But he was always involved in kind of software development. He knows how to use a PC. So he has always kind of has a fairly good understanding for technology, especially for his age. My mother, on the other hand, actually plays a lot of games, and I think she actually played more games than I did in total. She played most of Final Fantasy games, Suikoden, Breath of Fire, Arc the Lad, a lot of different games, especially JRPGs. I mean, that's kind of that's something my childhood was essentially. I mean, I played a lot of games in my childhood as well, but my mother did so too, and I often actually watched her playing games. That's something I did in the past. And yeah.
Would it be fair to say that that was one of the biggest inspirations about why you decided to go into games?
Certainly could be one of the reasons. I mean, early on, actually, I can remember back when we got our first Super Nintendo. I think when I was playing A Link to the Past back then, I think it was fairly close to when it was released. Even then, I was kind of getting excited about the concept of creating games like this, and I still remember how I was actually drawing some small kind of concepts on paper on how you could make games like this and how they would look like. And I mean, thanks to my mother, I mean, she always allowed me and my brother and everybody to play these games. And she played it herself, and she was always kind of like there. You could talk with her about these kind of stuff. So that's why I've always been much about games in my childhood. So it's kind of like the thing has always been around. So I would say it probably has some impact of on how this whole thing develops. So I think probably a good reason why I ended up doing game development.
I think that you probably just made a large number of members in the audience very jealous. It's like a fantastic mother to have.
Well, as it's, I mean, it was not always everything was great, but it still is nice to have kind of like at least part of your family to be open to this. So it's always helpful.
Were they very supportive when you decided to embark on independent games?
I'm kind of lucky in that my family has always been very kind of they always gave us a lot of freedom on what we want to do. They kind of like supported us, but they never kind of told us what we should do. And they have been very open. But to be honest, it's not like I just straight up went and said, hey, I want to go develop games. Actually, that took me a long time to actually get to this point. I actually decided first to just do normal computer science, which is, I think most parents wouldn't complain, or at least shouldn't complain about that, because I still think to this day that's a good choice. If you want to study computer science, I think you are fine. So nobody complained about that, obviously. But then when I started the whole crowdfunding campaign, I mean, I have to be honest, I was already fairly independent around this time. I have worked at university for about 2 years, I would say, as some kind of a scientific member, or how would you say, wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter? I don't know the translation really. Assistant or something.
Research assistant, maybe?
Research assistant, that's the one, exactly. So I worked already for, I think, 1 or 2 years at this time. So I was fairly independent, and I also financed the whole crowdfunding campaign and stuff, because that has been done before. I essentially financed myself, and I didn't really ask my family for money or anything. There was just maybe one exception where I for some short time I had to borrow some money, and they had no problem with that at all. But still, I mean, they never kind of like told me that this is kind of like a direction I should avoid. Anything, they have always been open and supportive to whatever I decide to do in that direction.
I can tell you definitely for sure, you obviously have our support. Hopefully that people in the audience who are listening now, they would definitely be supporting you, since we are crazy about the product you're making right now. It's fantastic.
It's great to hear that.
Going back to sort of your as a student and learning in university, what kind of student were you going to school?
Like, you mean when I started university or before that?
Well, you could trace it back before then,
Well, I mean, back in the school days, I mean, I was essentially like more or less your typical nerd. Well, not maybe that typical, but kind of like, I mean, I was into video games, not so much about all the social stuff. I mean, some people probably know that story. I was pretty good at math pretty early on. I was always pretty good at math. And I think that's always a good foundation if you like programming, because especially if you study computer science, there's always a lot of math involved. It's hard to avoid that. That's kind of like, I also did some physics. Physics was rather interesting. I mean, I was good in physics, but I wasn't actually that much interested in it. So I never was that much interested in all the other natural science, like chemistry, physics, biology. It was kind of like a thing I could work with, but I wasn't all that interested. In the end, I was actually very much about computers. It was rather strange that for some reason, one of the teachers back then actually suggested some of us pupils to not study computer science. I never understand why. I think there was some stories going around that there was kind of like some programming people not getting jobs because there was too much, not enough demand or something. But I mean, even today, I think programmers are still needed. So that was kind of strange. I don't even know how that actually happened back then. But anyway, I still decided to study computer science because that was the one thing that actually really I had most fun with. So, and I think back in my head, I always kind of like still had this kind of dream that I want to develop games, and I kind of knew that doing computer science and learning to program gets me closer to that. But I was always like kind of thinking, I was never really determined to directly go this way, but I always kind of like slowly moved in this direction, kind of like hoping that maybe it will work. But the thing is, I have always been a rather pessimistic person, so that's why I'm not this guy who goes straight up and say, I will work on games. That's my goal, and that's where I'm going to, because I had too many concerns on my head, because something could go wrong, or like it's difficult to get a job in game industry in Germany, which isn't all that big in Germany, and stuff like this. And I think I'm getting a bit of out topic here, but yeah, that's roughly how it went. Anyway, when I studied computer science, I had a focus on computer graphics. That's also probably because I was interested in games, because I mean, games is kind of like the connection of programming and graphics. And
How did you end up pursuing a graduate program degree?
all right, I did that. So that was essentially just I just went with the flow. Essentially, I studied bachelor first, and I went to the computer graphics chair, as I mentioned. That worked out pretty well. I liked working in this kind of direction. It was more about 3D graphics. I was still more interested in 2D graphics even back then. But still working on 3D graphics was pretty exciting. There was actually a lot of stuff about ray tracing and things like this, which hasn't been all that practical, but that's all what researchers are sometimes about. It's just trying new things. And then it kind of like evolved that I continued working in the same chair on my master's degree, which was still computer graphics. It was actually about integrating 3D graphics in a web browser. So that was kind of like the direction it went. And I mean, there was already an API for that, but we kind of tried a different approach, which was more about declarative 3D graphics. And that was also pretty cool. And then I just continued my PhD in that same direction, because honestly, it was interesting. I liked working on that, and I didn't have any complaints in that regard. So I continued working on this area. So I started my doctorate again, still working on this integrating 3D graphics on the web. It kind of like moved in a slightly different direction, but was more about generic data processing that is connected to 3D graphics, stuff like 3D transformations or geometric processing. If you have a skeletal animation in your 3D game, that's kind of like some processing that is connected to 3D graphics. And that is something I focused on in this during that time. And that was still interesting. But then I kind of like, in parallel to that, I started getting back into game development, and that in the end that took over.
What was the start? When you mentioned you started getting back into game development, what particular, was there a project that sparked it all of a sudden?
That was actually because of an internship. I mean, I probably should say before that is I did game development back even before I studied. Back when I was in school, I actually worked with the RPG Maker. RPG Maker 2000 was it back then? So, and that's something where some program that you can use to create pretty simple games. I mean, it's still around today. You still find RPG Maker games today on Steam. They don't always have the best reputation, but in the end, it's a pretty solid engine, and you can do pretty decent games with it. I mean, there's obviously a focus on storytelling, not so much on mechanics, because those are fairly fixed. But even back then, I actually tried to create pretty complicated mechanics that the whole engine wasn't actually designed for, but it kind of worked. So you did stuff like pre-rendering text to images and showing those images whenever you wanted to show some text, so you can create your own custom menus and create things like this. That's something I worked on back then. That's kind of like when I started studying computer science, it slowly stopped because I just didn't find any time to do that. And I got back into game development when I did an internship in 2011 in Japan. because that was actually originally about Android development, but this actually changed right at the beginning. They then decided that it's actually about HTML5 development. They wanted us to create a game in HTML5. And that was around this time when I actually it was kind of funny because I already had experience with HTML5 back then because of what I did at my university. I was working on this integrating 3D and the web thing, so I already had some experience with web technologies. And now they actually essentially asked us to create a game based on HTML5. And then that is when I discovered that HTML5 is actually far enough. It has progressed enough to actually support complicated applications like games. And then, so that was for half a year, and we actually developed some kind of something like a Farmville clone, which just that it was based on HTML5. And I think for half a year for that small team that we have been, it was pretty decent, I think. I mean, it wasn't really complete in the end, because I think you need more time or more people to do that actually. But it still was rather decent, and that's how kind of like what sparked my interest in trying this technology to create games. And when I came back to Germany, I actually continued. Actually, that was around the time I started my PhD. And around at the same time, I also started to work on CrossCode. That actually happened right after that internship, more or less, maybe like a month after that. I kind of like, I looked around what is actually there on HTML5 engines. Then I found Impact.js. I downloaded Impact.js, and then the whole thing started essentially. I just played around, created like a first prototype of an engine, and then a lot of other people got involved, and then RadicalFishGames was founded, and then CrossCode was more or less developed.
How long did it take for you to put together a team?
That kind of, it kind of like just happened. I mean, for me, it was more at the beginning. It was all about just creating a game, a prototype, and there's Stefan, a friend of mine that I actually met over the internet. He was also part of this RPG Maker community. There's kind of like this more RPG Maker community, and back when I created games with RPG Maker, I was part of this community, and I actually met a lot of people back then, and most of the people at RadicalFishGames are actually not people from this community. So most people I met online. And Stefan was actually the one who suggested that we should create a company, that we should try to make this commercial. Because back then I was actually just playing around and kind of like making progress, but I didn't really think far enough to actually make it something commercial. But then kind of Stefan kind of like, he sparked kind of like the whole idea that we should make something bigger out of that. And he was also a computer scientist, and we are both programmers in the end. So in the beginning, there was kind of like this phase where we both kind of programmed our own engine stuff, but we decided that we eventually want to work together. And eventually, Stefan decided to also work on CrossCode because it was progressing more smoothly. Then we both kind of started working on the engine, and Stefan kind of more focused on GUI and interface design, while I'm more focused on the engine and entity, on map content. Then over time, more and more people joined the team. Again, those has mostly been people that we knew from the community before that. So essentially, we had just a bunch of friends that just got together and worked on the game. And then, of course, some friends of friends also joined. Like we had our pixel artist, Thomas Fröse. He's one who actually joined pretty early on. He had another friend who went to the same school as he did, and he just kind of like dragged him to the team as well. And that's our concept artist now. He also did some pixel art graphics. And our sound guy is also somebody who, and also our composer. These are both people we met through the RPG Maker community. Through our composer, we also got a contact to another person who helped us with sounds. That's Iron. And then there's also Martina Pröhle. She's another pixel artist who I've known for a long time, also from that community. And she also helps us with map graphics. And the list goes on. So in the end, we have a lot of people that help out essentially, and most of them do this part-time. So they are kind of like, it's kind of contractor work. So we just give them a small task and they work on that, and they get money by the hour, this kind of stuff. So we don't have a lot of full-time employment. Up to this day, it's only me and Stefan. We are the both full-time employees. We are doing this full-time, and most other people are helping out part-time.
Do you consider yourself kind of like the chief or the boss? People kind of regard you as that, I guess, rather than a friend or coworker.
Oh, it's a bit difficult. I mean, in the end, I think I'm the one who makes the final decision if there is any conflict. In the end, we have a pretty democratic process when we develop games. So we talk about stuff, and when there's different different opinions, we kind of like try to find something that most people agree with. So it's not like I just dictate everything and people have to do what I want. That's not how it works usually. But in the end, I'm kind of like I think somebody who, for the most part, takes initiative to do things and decides a lot of stuff beforehand. It's kind of like I come up with a concept, then I present the concept, we talk about it. And sometimes people suggest changes and sometimes just stays this way. And then that's why in the end, I consider myself the creative director. I think that's something, how you might call it. So like the guy who decides a lot of stuff, but it's not that it's always me who decides everything in the end. And I guess I'm also the one who kind of like tries to manage the whole thing, kind of like scheduling regular meetings. Stefan sometimes helps out with that. So it's not like I'm doing everything. It's also sometimes that Stefan is taking care of managing some people when it's about certain other things. It should also be mentioned that a lot of parts that we are working on are actually pretty, I think automatous is the word. There's, for instance, Geflügel. He's working on quests, and these days he essentially comes up with an idea, and maybe he quickly explains me that idea, and I think, yeah, that sounds good. And then he essentially takes care of everything. He implements the whole quest. He even asks our graphics artist for sprites for this quest, so they can work on that for special graphics. And then he just makes everything from start to end, and I don't even have to take care of that much. And so that's how things work these days, that at least some people in the team are now working independently on content, and that really helps a lot to create more content. So it's not like I have to take care of everything in the game. That's also how the same is true for stuff like we have a lot of lore texts, like background information. And I'm actually not that much involved in writing that. That's also done entirely by Stefan and Geflügel. And also when it comes to items and balancing and these kind of things. So now, like a lot of parts of the game are actually not made by me at all. That I entirely trusted to those people, to these other guys to do a good job and to do a good job at this, and they also do. So it really works out that way. So we have kind of like have some separation. Some work separation that works rather well, I think. But I think in the end, I'm the one who started the whole project, and when we have, I think, any different opinions, I'm the one who would decide in the end. But I usually try to avoid that, so I always try to find kind of like something where most team members will agree with.
I think this is from an experience that you and I can both sort of relate to. It sounds not unlike an academic lab and how research is kind of done.
That could be the case, actually. Now that I think about it, I mean, the lab we had at our chair was kind of special in that I actually worked with other people together on something which, I mean, it wasn't really a product, but it was sort of close to it. It was kind of like a software project with a lot of connected features. So it was not just one prototype thing created by one person, but a larger software project where several people worked on together. And we kind of like made research work based on this product, which sometimes was a bit hard to write papers about this because we had sometimes too much, which doesn't help. And it was a lot of engineering work involved, but that's kind of what I like because I'm actually not that much of a research person at the end. I like to work on practical stuff. And this area we have been working on was in the end pretty practical for research work, I would say. We actually had a high focus on usability and making technology accessible. So that was kind of our goal. It was not so much about creating really new technology that hasn't been around before, but more about making it accessible to more people. So it was a lot about creating some kind of library that was easy to use for a lot of people. And that involves a lot of engineering. So it's not just about creating a small, nice algorithm, but about creating kind of like a library that just works in many use cases. So that was, I think, kind of different. So I don't think I really experienced like this very true academic work environment because of that. But still, I mean, the way we worked back there was kind of similar because we had several people working on that, and we often sat together, discussed ideas on how to do things, and even our professor was, of course, involved back then. But there wasn't any strict hierarchy. A lot of people had ideas, and we kind of shared those ideas, and sometimes people just worked on different things, and we just made sure that it kind of worked together. So that is kind of similar to how we do things in RadicalFishGames, yeah.
Was your professor very supportive of your game development? Has he played CrossCode before?
I don't think he actually played it because I think he's just way too busy for that. He's one of those professors that's very good at getting fundings, so he's mostly busy doing that. But yeah, he was very supportive of my decision. The funny thing is that, I mean, I worked at the chair back then. When I decided to focus on the game, that kind of like happened after 2 years, I think. I decided that I now want to, at least for some time, focus on the game so we can do this crowdfunding campaign that we did on Indiegogo. And I talked to him, and he said that he would essentially just pause the whole contract so I don't get paid over that time, obviously. But he said that if it doesn't work out, I can always come back and continue working for him. And now that in the end, it did work out, so we reached our funding goal, and that's why we are now working full-time on CrossCode. But my professor still said that it's actually fine that I can't just work in the university. So he actually allows me to still go to the office in the chair and have my workplace there, which is probably related to the fact that our chair doesn't have a lot of students these days. It's kind of related to the fact that our professor he takes care of this chair, but also another institute where he is also a director, actually. And he's kind of like at both places, and one of those places has all the students, and the research chair is actually fairly empty these days. So that's why there's a lot of space, and that's why there's no reason to throw me out, because otherwise the office would be just empty. So that's why that's still very generous. And he still occasionally talk with him and tell him how things are going, and I think he kind of hopes that I might come back to do research work, even though it currently doesn't look that way, unfortunately, for him. And to be honest, it was kind of a difficult decision for me as well, because it's not like I didn't like the research work. It was also an interesting field, I think. And I was kind of really excited for the stuff we did back then, but I was also very excited for CrossCode. And eventually I had to do the decision. I had to make the decision because the most difficult part was really to balance both of these things. It was like the first 2 years when I worked on CrossCode part-time, but at the same time kind of worked on my PhD. It's also not something that you can do in all kind of PhD positions, I think, because, I mean, from what I heard, sometimes you can have an advisor that actually makes sure that you really make some decent progress and that you also work on your topic. And that wasn't the case for me because, I did work on the topic and I make progress, but it's not like nobody actually made sure that I always work on it. And that's how I managed to also work on the game in parallel to this. But still, even though I could kind of like manage working on both things, it was really stressful, and it's difficult to make progress if you have to focus on two things like this. And that's why I decided I have to go full-time if I ever plan to finish this game.
Is everyone in RadicalFishGames kind of based locally within Germany, or are there a couple people internationally in the world?
In the beginning, I think pretty much everybody was in Germany except for one guy who's from Austria. Yeah, Teku, or like I think his nickname is Teku. He's still in Vienna, so that's the only exception. So back then when we started, everybody was in Germany, but one person now actually moved to Finland. So it's actually all Germans, one guy from Austria and one somebody else from Finland. So, and that's it. We had some help from the United States in between. That's something I should mention. So we had like one concept artist and one pixel artist who helped us out, who are both from the state. But that has only been going on for like a rather short time, I would say a couple of months. And these days they are again working on other things, but still, I should be fair and should mention them, I guess.
How did the name for the company come about?
So my nickname has always been Lachsen. Lachs is a German word for salmon, which is a fish. So the original source of the name wasn't really about the fish, but in the end, everybody associated my name with a fish. So that's why I said, whatever, I'm now a fish. So then I started using fish avatars and stuff like this. And in the end, I was just a fish, and I decided, okay, that's fine. Also helps that my how do you say Sternzeichen? What are these kind of? Let me just check the word.
Of course.
We do have internet here. Yeah, the star sign. It is literally star sign. Or a zodiacal sign. These kind of stuff.
Yeah, the Pisces. Yeah.
Yes, the Pisces, right? So I'm the Pisces. So that.
Is that how you ended up with the nickname?
No, that's just a coincidence. Yeah. Again, that was because my nickname, Lachsen. That is a strange story. Kind of like. It was because back then in school people called me Relaxo, which is Snorlax in German. It's a German. The Pokemon Snorlax is called Relaxo in Germany. That's what people called me at school.
Okay.
So then this kind of transformed to Relaxo, the Lax, and then Lachsen. It's kind of like some strange name transformation. And then this is just my name. It doesn't make much sense, but it kind of I just stick with it. And then again, so that's why it's fish. And the radical comes from Stefan. His nickname is RD or Radical Dude or something like this. I think there have been several translations, but it was Radical Dude, at least for some time. And then we kind of like the fish and the Radical Dude together are RadicalFishGames.
Oh, that's great.
That's how the name decided. And then we had this fantastic idea to make a fish with sunglasses. And everybody immediately agreed that this would be the best mascot ever. Yeah, and the mustache. Don't forget the mustache. Very important.
Do you have a mustache?
No. Nobody in our team has a mustache, but we still think the mustache is awesome.
Were there any particular other things in media, other games, or anything that kind of helped contribute to what you ultimately saw that CrossCode would be? What were your biggest inspirations from that?
Oh, that's different games. And what also should be mentioned that the project CrossCode is actually pretty old because it didn't start in 2011 when I started working on the HTML5 version. It started even before then. I think it might have been 2008 or 2009, sometime around that. Because back then it was some kind of, there was a small game jam with the RPG Maker back then, and we just created a crazy game which was about throwing balls that bounce on walls. And back then it was, I think, called Spherical. It was called Spherical, I think. Oh no, it was actually called Felser Ball, which is some kind of pun on one of the other games I worked on back then. But anyway, so that worked actually surprisingly well. No, that's not true. Actually, it didn't work all that well, but it sort of worked because RPG Maker only has tile movements, and that's kind of a problem if you have a game which is so much about movement and precise precision, about throwing projectiles in a precise direction. So it kind of worked, but it was ultimately we stopped working on that because I also had other projects back then that I wanted to focus on. And it just didn't work good enough with this engine. RPG Maker just wasn't flexible enough for this kind of game. But the idea still was there, and I still thought it was nice. Back then, the inspiration actually was Yoshi's Island.
Ah,
Yoshi's Island,
yeah.
Super Mario World 2. That was I loved this game back then. I think still to this day is one of my favorite platformers. What I really like about it is just this the egg throwing. You could throw eggs and they bounced on walls, and I thought this was fantastic. Like how much stuff you could do with that, and all those puzzles you could do. And I thought, man, you don't have a lot of games that actually do that. And I thought, okay, why not make a game like this? Only it's top down, because I think RPG Maker is even worse if you do platformers. So at least we said we make it top down, because RPG Maker is designed for top down games. And then you have like this concept in top down. That was kind of like the first idea. And back then it was more about just the throwing mechanics, a bit of combat, but mostly puzzles. And it worked pretty well. Again, then we stopped doing that. And then sometime later, I actually decided to create this again. I picked it up and worked on kind of like a DS homebrew version back then. I think that might have been actually 2008 and 2009. I think the initial prototype might have been as far back as 2006 or 2005. Now that I think about it, it was really old. Anyway, so then when I did the DS version, I think I started getting this idea to not just make it a mini game, but actually evolve it into an RPG. Or I'm actually not sure. I think this actually might have happened when I started working on the HTML5 version. And yeah, when it comes to the RPG stuff, I think it's not just one game that inspired that. There's a whole bunch of games that kind of inspired us to make it into this final game we have today. It was like, I think one game that probably had a very big influence was Xenoblade Chronicles, the original game for the Wii. Because now that I think about it, I played this game shortly before I started working on CrossCode, so it kind of makes sense that it was a very big inspiration. And I was also like really impressed by this game. It was around this time, 2011, and I thought JRPGs, I was a huge JRPG fan, but I kind of lost interest in JRPGs, mostly because Final Fantasy 13 was kind of disappointing for me. Didn't really, a lot of people have been disappointed with that game as far as I know. And Xenoblade Chronicles kind of like was this idea. It was a JRPG, but it took a lot of great inspirations from Western RPGs. It made the world more open. So you had essentially kind of a mixture of an open world and an JRPG game, at least to some extent. The game was still pretty linear. It had a pretty traditional JRPG story, but instead of just walking this corridor that you had in Final Fantasy 13, you actually could move around really freely. So you had always a pretty big environment that you could freely explore. You had always a lot of quests, a lot of generic quests, to be honest. But still, I still liked this. Just walking around, you could just collect a whole bunch of quests. You kill enemies, and you get your message that you accomplished something. And there was like a really great sense of exploration in this game, because just in the way the world has been designed. It was always about moving around, finding certain spots on the map, and getting up to a high place, having a great view over the whole area, and then jumping down into the water. You could actually do that without dying, so that was also great. And all this that's something I never had before in a game when I played it. I'm pretty sure there are other games who did this way before that, but for me that was the first to actually have this kind of exploration feeling. And they really nailed it. So Monolith really did something great back then, I thought. And I continued doing this. Xenoblade Chronicles X is also great, and you can now see it in Breath of the Wild. that's kind of they had that part in this game. You can really see it. Anyway, so that was really a big inspiration for me back then, and I think that's why I really wanted to create an RPG in the end, because that was such a great RPG experience. And you can really see CrossCode is really similar in many ways, that you can move around freely. You regenerate HP immediately, which is exactly like in Xenoblade Chronicles. You can you have a lot of quests that you can accept, and some of those quests actually are solved immediately, just like in Xenoblade Chronicles. And in general, there's a big part of exploration in CrossCode. I think that's pretty much because it's not just me. I mean, Stefan and a lot of other team members are fans of this game. So that's why we all decided to make something in this direction. And apart from that, games like, of course, Secret of Mana, big inspiration because the graphic style, Chrono Trigger also very similar. A lot of Final Fantasy games obviously probably are mixed in there one way or the other. It's just games that we all played more or less. Devil May Cry is also a bit in there because that's something that me and Stefan both played a lot. Stefan played it a lot. I also played it at least to some extent, and we really like this kind of action-based combat, and I think there's some influence of that can be found in CrossCode. Also Kingdom Hearts, which also has a very action-focused combat system. Valkyrie Profile is always for me a very big inspiration because that was one game that really kind of impacted me a lot back then. I was really like just the way the storytelling was done, even though I'm not even sure if there's anything Valkyrie Profile like found in CrossCode, but if you look closely, you might find something. And last but not least, also Terranigma. That's actually a Super Nintendo game which was not released in the United States as far as I know still. It was released in Europe and Japan, actually, and it was a very nice action RPG, especially back at the time. And there's a lot of inspiration from that went into CrossCode, and also some references, really. If you look closely at the level up pose in CrossCode and compare that to Terranigma, you will see the similarity, I think.
One thing that I personally think is you combine puzzles, at times somewhat frustrating puzzles. One game that tends to come to mind that has the same feeling is Alundra.
All right, yeah, I forgot about that one. Alundra definitely is also a big inspiration for us, just like a lot of Zelda games, of course, as well, when it comes to puzzles. But Alundra is also one game of my childhood. Alundra was a great game because it kind of like took the Zelda formula, but in terms of story, I always thought it was much more interesting. It was not this generic, you have to save the princess from this big evil thing and you have to collect all these MacGuffins. It was kind of like about this village, and all these villagers had a lot of kind of impact to the story. There were kind of many villagers were relevant to the story, and you kind of had this whole plot about dreams and how you entered the dreams of the people, and you learned so much about the people in the dreams and about all their relationships and all this kind of stuff, and that made it so much more interesting, I thought. So that I still think that is it's a great game in that sense. And the puzzles, yes, Alundra puzzles can be really harsh. So even though it's never my goal to create really harsh puzzles, that's something that always happens automatically. As a game developer, you tend to make stuff too difficult automatically because you're just too good at your own game. That's something that happens automatically. And I mean, CrossCode, I always try to kind of like make something that I hope that most people can beat it, but it's probably still a good deal more difficult than maybe some other modern AAA games that are more hand-holding in that regard, I guess. But yeah.
How did the story... Well, actually, let me backtrack a bit. One of the things that I tend to see a lot from reviews, and there's many reviews, some people have called it a parody of MMORPGs, but what would your response be to that? How would you describe CrossCode in your own words as the creator?
The interesting thing about this whole MMO setting was actually not how the game started. The game really started with this idea, similar to how Nintendo tends to start games, like the very basic gameplay approach, which was about throwing balls that bounce on walls. That was how it started. And then the whole idea was, yes, we have this nice concept and you can do a lot of great puzzles with that. And then we wanted to make it into an RPG. And since stories are always important to an RPG, I was thinking, okay, what kind of story can you make around this whole concept of throwing balls? And I didn't get any other idea than what essentially .hack did already back in the days. You're playing an MMO, so it's a game about a game.
I think so for some of us in the audience who may not be huge on anime. I mean, I know I'm aware of what .hack is, but would you be able to kind of explain it in short words?
Sure. .hack is, I think, it's not just a game. I think it was a whole franchise back then. It was like several anime shows and several video games released under that name. And it was all about playing somebody who plays an MMO. So I think it never was really an MMO or any online game. It was always offline games as far as I know. And that's essentially what CrossCode does. So you play somebody who plays an MMO, and it was always about kind of like there was always some mystery surrounding stuff that happens in that MMO, which also involves the players playing the MMO. And it was always a very interesting concept, I thought. And I didn't play a lot of .hack games. I think I just played the first PlayStation 2 game that was released, and I enjoyed it, but didn't get so much into it that I played all the games. Stefan actually played a few more. He also played this .hack GU, I think, which actually seems to be a pretty nice game from what I understood. I saw a bit of it, but I actually never played it myself. But yeah, so that was essentially the inspiration story-wise, because I had an issue kind of like finding a good explanation how to include those crazy puzzles, and that's why I decided of that story, which is kind of cheap, but in the end, it kind of just led to this whole thing, and it works rather well in the end. So then even though it is an MMO story, I tried to do things a bit. We tried to do things a bit different compared to what .hack did, but I of course I don't want to spoil too much.
Yeah, of course. We don't. The story, as I understand, the story is still in the middle of being written, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we plan actually to release the conclusion of the story at the very end when the game is complete. So essentially, we say the game is complete when the story is complete, because we want people to really enjoy the story and in the final state. Some people actually made a suggestion in the reviews that why don't you just release the full game first and then improve details, how some other early access title do it. And I thought, I don't want to do this, because if you release kind of like an unfinished game where you can play the full story, people will play the full story but don't get a very good experience out of it. And the thing about JRPGs, these kind of narrative-driven RPGs, is that there's not a very high replayability. And if you play the story once, you might not be interested in playing it again. So that's why I want to make sure that when people finish the story, they should already have the best experience possible. So that's why I want to release the final story when the game is complete.
I would agree with that. I remember, I think the version, not the one you released recently, I think it was still version 0.8. A lot of gamers who were playing at the time, when you got to Fajro Temple and that was the end of the story, I think that was, for me, that was a little bit of a downer. I was like, I wanted to see what would happen next.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I understand why people might really. I mean, that's a good sign. That means that the story seems to work if people really want to know how it continues. But the thing is, I mean, now that you think about it, a lot of novels and TV shows do exactly the same thing. They kind of like release just a story as far as they get, and then just cut, and then you have to wait for the next season or the next novel. And sometimes you really want to know how it continues. For instance, I don't know, A Song of Ice and Fire. Been waiting for the next book for a long time. It's also one novel that I also read myself. So it actually happens a lot. We could just go ahead and just release a story as far as we have developed it, and that's it. But I made the decision to kind of like hold off story development for the last part of development, so that we can first focus on all the other content, stuff like areas, dungeons, side quests, and things like this. So that's something that we focused on mostly the last 2 years and that we had early access now. And most of those are now complete. And that's why we now decide to continue the story, trying to deliver most of the story in a pretty narrow time frame. So the goal is to not make the players wait for a very long time until the story is complete. That's why we decided to do it that way.
What was behind the decision to make Leia as a mute character? It works, and you see it in a lot of other games, like Ys, for example. Adol Kristen is a very well-known, popular mute character. What was the decision behind doing that?
There was, I think there wasn't any big particular reason. I think an inspiration for me personally was Okami or the Okami. So Okami is another great example how you have a game which is kind of like Zelda but does something more interesting. I'm kind of like always comparing things favorably to Zelda. I'm still a very big Zelda fan, but I always kind of like find it funny how people kind of spin off and kind of try to improve things that Zelda just doesn't do in all the 10 or 20 games they have released. Anyway, but Okami is kind of like Zelda, but the story is more this kind of Eastern mythology, like traditional Japanese mythology thing, which is rather cool. And I always thought that the writing of this game was really nice. And you had you had a wolf. You played a wolf essentially that couldn't talk because it was a wolf, not because your character was silent, because you have been a wolf that couldn't talk. And kind of people sort of reacted that way. And what I really liked about it is that you had some kind of conversations. There was this small guy who was always with you, who was taking care of all the talking for you. And there was, I think, one part where this guy was kind of missing. And then you had just the wolf, and characters still tried to talk with you. And then this guy was missing, not talking for you, but you just saw the wolf just standing there doing nothing. And I thought it was one of the most hilarious parts of the game. And I think that was a little bit like this inspiration where I realized, okay, having somebody that doesn't talk, but making other characters aware of that fact might actually be pretty funny. And I think that was kind of like that sparked the idea of having a literally mute character, not just a character that you're supposed to identify with. That's not what Leia is. Leia is her own character, but she just can't talk because of reasons. And this kind of limited, that's the thing that you can just say limited words kind of emphasizes the fact that she is really literally mute, because that way you actually understand that she can just say certain words.
I guess you're free to answer this, or this is related to the story. You don't have to answer this, but is there going to be some time later on when she actually does say something a bit more verbose?
Yeah, I don't want to comment on that.
Okay, sure. No
that's
problem.
Kind of like spoiler direction.
Yeah, no problem at all. Let's talk briefly about the character design, though. Did any of the characters, or especially Leia, were there any sort of stages of evolution where her animation or her design changed through time?
The design back then, when we did the first prototype with RPG Maker, was that we just took some charts that we found and we just took some graphics from some characters that we found and just modified it, so that there wasn't really any design for that. But then the design for Leia actually was created, I think back then in 2008, 2009 already, when I decided to create this DS homebrew version of the game. And I don't think there was any inspiration in particular, nor did I think about it. Really, that's kind of like the thing how I work. It's kind of like, especially back then, I didn't really work much with reference, and I just was drawing something that was in my head, and that's kind of like how it ended up with. It's kind of random, but yeah, there wasn't any big inspiration back then for the design, and I don't think it changed too much. We only changed a few details. I think my design back then actually was made the way that you couldn't see barely any skin, and we thought it looks like a bit. We thought what would be more interesting if you at least see a little bit of skin, like in a way how clothings usually work. And then we kind of changed small details like this, but otherwise it's stayed pretty much the same. I think later character designs were done more with a collaboration, so it was always me or somebody else creating a concept, and then we were discussing things, and everybody was kind of like contributing something. We were sketching things, and then we decided to design. That's how design for Emily, for instance, was created, and many other characters as well.
Do you do a large amount of the design and artwork?
I still do for characters. Well, I used to create all the portraits, but that was back from when we had the old portraits, which haven't been all that great, because I mean that was interesting because most people didn't comment on the portraits, but occasionally there have been some people saying that the portraits could be better, and it was like some people actually writing pretty harsh comments on YouTube videos, like something you would just something you might just say is just a hater. That's kind of like the way it was described. But I actually tried to listen to that and asking what could have been done better. And I saw this happening on several occasions, and especially some people saying that they first saw screenshots of the character with the portraits. It didn't look so great. But then I played it and decided, oh, it's actually great after all. And then I actually realized that these portraits, they don't give the best first impression. And then we decided to overhaul the whole portraits. And then it was not just me drawing them, but that's when the people, those two collaborators from the United States, actually helped us out, creating an improved version of the portraits. I also still worked on them. I'm still doing the expressions mostly of the characters. And but there was now more people involved to kind of like guarantee a better quality. So kind of we have more people working on it, looking over it, and making sure that things look fine. And I think the portraits are now okay the way they are. And yeah, that's what I'm partly working on. But what I'm mostly working on graphic-wise these days is just map graphics, because most animated graphics like NPCs and enemies and these kind of things are now done for the most part by Thomas Fröse. He's now a big pixel animation guy. He's very good at pixel animation, so that's also in terms of effects, he does most of them. And Freezy also does some of those graphics. So, and we also have Martina, who does map graphics, but in the end, when it comes to map graphics, it's a lot about creating tiles that are easy to use, and that's sometimes a bit complicated because you have to create tiles that always match to each other, and it's not just about drawing something that's pretty, but you have something that's structures exactly the right way, and that's something that it turns out that it's best when I just do it myself. So it just ends up that Martina creates some graphics, which looks pretty nice, and then I take those graphics and I work over them and make them into proper tiles.
Was it always envisioned that Leia would be a female protagonist?
Yeah, pretty early on. Even back then, the prototype was a female protagonist. And there was no big reason behind that. It's just that I thought, hey, let's just make a female protagonist. Maybe because I played Valkyrie Profile, which had a female Valkyrie, which was a great female protagonist, I thought. And I was kind of like, I think that was maybe one of the inspirations why I decided, yeah, let's just make her female.
One of the comments I always wanted to make before was people joke that a lot of games, for females, it seems like whatever armor you pick up seems the more skin you show, the higher your defense is.
Yeah.
It's pretty refreshing to see a female protagonist who is, looks plain, not in a bad way though, but plain in a good way.
Yeah, I kind of think so myself. I mean, to be honest, back then when Leia's design was created, I think I wouldn't even have been capable of creating these kind of skinny outfits because I think I would have been too embarrassed back then to actually draw that. It's kind of interesting if you think about it, because back then I was kind of like the style that I wasn't really. It's kind of strange. I was never so much into this whole aesthetic where you have barely clothed female characters. I think it's maybe because if you think about it, in JRPGs, those are not too present either. If you think about Final Fantasy characters, like, okay, there's Tifa, but Tifa just have the proportions, but not the matching clothings, if you think about it. But characters like Rinoa, 588, and Yuna from 510, I mean, those are all pretty normally clothed female characters, right? So those have been the inspirations for me. The same for Valkyrie Profile. Like, Valkyrie Profile was actually pretty great in that it had nice looking, but still fairly accurate character designs. So they kind of looked like warriors and people wearing armors. And so you had female characters in full-clad armor. And I thought, hey, that's great. That sounds plausible. I always was kind of like a fan of these kind of plausible designs. And it just felt naturally for me to do that. It was never about I had to do that because people want to see that way or that I want to do it any other way. It's just I just thought it was like the most realistic and nice way to do designs. But to be perfectly honest, I think Leia's design isn't even the best design. It's just how it happened. But it kind of works, but I can imagine that it might be frustrating for cosplayers to actually stress this layer, because I think some of those things probably won't work that well in practice.
I'm assuming there must be a pretty large fan base also in Japan and in East Asia as well.
I think it's not that large, but I mean, we do have a fair amount of players, definitely, on Steam. And I think there's not too much in Asia yet because of the language barrier, obviously. I think it's not that common for Japanese people to play English games. So that's why we are kind of like working on that direction, because we kind of hope to reach Asian people like Japanese, Korean, Chinese people who want them to play our game as well, because in the end it was their games that inspired this game, and so kind of we want them to play our game. So that would feel great if they would play it. Still, I think the fan base isn't too big. I mean, it's nothing like the big indie success titles where you have huge fan bases, I think. But it's kind of growing. So because, I mean, the game has been going on, has been active. More people have been buying the game as the early access progressed.
So are there, I don't know if you're also allowed to mention this, are there plans to do a console release?
Consoles are a little bit complicated. Actually, something we didn't talk about much is, I mean, I kind of mentioned that this game is based on HTML5, right? On the one hand, it's great because I still think the technology is very nice to work with. So development is rather fast because we work with HTML5, I think. But the downside is HTML5 is difficult to port to consoles. It's not like you use an engine like Unreal or Unity that actually support already porting the games to different consoles. Nor do you have a very native code where you could just take what is provided. Like if you have a C++ code base, you could just take that, look at what the consoles provided. And of course, that is some work. But what we have to do actually is implement a browser that works in a console context. And browsers are pretty complicated applications. There are a lot of open source browsers out there that we could use, but we still need to port those open source browser frameworks to work on the console, and they have to work well enough to support CrossCode. And I don't think that's easy. So that's kind of like the thing that makes it hard for us to port CrossCode to consoles right now. We still want to do that, but we either need time and money to do that, and that's also why I don't plan to do that before the release on PC and Mac. So if anything, it will happen after that release. Or we find somebody who helps us with that. So somebody who takes care of porting the game to the console. But that kind of, I think this has to happen by creating a wrapper application that runs the HTML5 code base, because you don't want to reprogram the whole game into a different language, because CrossCode is pretty complicated technically. It is a very ambitious game from the technical side in the end, so that's why porting the whole code base, I think, would take way too long, and it would be kind of a waste too.
I'm not a programmer by any means, but was the decision to always do CrossCode in HTML5?
No, I mean that happened in 2011 again, because I mean the concept has been around for some time. I first did it on RPG Maker, then I did it on C++, and it worked on C++. It was on the Nintendo DS homebrew, so that was actually also on a pretty low-end system, you could say. Like, you really had a lot of limitations on Nintendo DS, and you had to be careful about that. So I kind of experienced how it is to work with C++ in this context, and it just was so much work. And that's why I kind of lost the motivation and I actually stopped doing that, and for some time went back to RPG Maker instead of working on C++ for Nintendo DS homebrew. And HTML5, in comparison to that, was so easy to work with that I think that's the reason why this whole project even got so far. I mean, it was kind of like this whole technology environment that I felt really familiar with, that was really productive to work with for me. And that's kind of like how this whole thing grew into what we have today. So it wouldn't have happened without HTML5. It wasn't just some point, what do I do? Well, let's just take HTML5. It's kind of like it grew out of this ambition to create an awesome game based on HTML5, and it wouldn't have been created any other way.
One of the things that I've noticed too is interesting is as you're playing in the game, you can report things like there's a bug report. You can also put in typos and correct typos that are there.
Mhm.
Was that also envisioned in the beginning to have a fan-based sort of proofreading group there?
I think those things kind of just evolved over time. I think the proofreading feature may have not been around in the very first versions, but I'm not perfectly sure. I don't quite remember. But I think like in around when early access started, I just got this idea because the nice thing about HTML5 is you can very easily just embed some small web formula. So it's actually really easy to just implement this a small form that people can use to submit a bug. So it was implemented in a rather short time, and I just implemented a small web API where we receive those submissions, those spelling corrections, and then we have on our end in our editors we have a nice interface to embed those corrections, and it's a very productive process to fix spelling errors. And since we are not native English speakers, it's a very good thing we have that. Our texts are not always the best from the very beginning. There might be a lot of bugs here or some rather strange English here and there. So it's always great to have this community with native speakers who look over that and make suggestions. And we have some fans now of a community who really do a lot of who contribute a lot in that regard. So that we're really thankful for that. And I think it really worked out well in the end.
One of the common questions you hear a lot are video games art, or if there's kind of a theme or message behind a lot of games.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of deep message that you would say is in CrossCode in some way?
That definitely is related to the story. And that's also why I'm not going to tell you any details. But I think there is, at least to some extent, there is some kind of moral lesson in the story, I think. But I'm not going to tell you what it is.
Sure. No, please don't. Don't do that. Don't spoil it.
Yeah.
One last question for this is, if there's anything you wanted to say to all of the fans out there in the audience, what would you want to say to them?
Boy, that's the most difficult question. But yeah, well, just to everybody who's playing CrossCode and contributing to what we're doing, I just want to say thank you, because I'm always kind of surprised how much impact this whole community collaboration in the end had on the game. It's it's not like everything was pretty open from we had already our goal set, but a lot of details have been tuned thanks to the community in a very good way. And I actually kind of that's why I think I actually realized that early access is a really great thing. If you think about it, in theory, it's a really great thing if you actually make a good use of it. Like having a community, listening to the community, taking feedback, trying to improve details. And I think it really helps you to polish a game in a way that you wouldn't be able to do yourself if you would be just a small development team. So that's why I want to just say thank you for everybody helping us out, creating a very good game, hopefully.
Now that we've come to the end of the interview, some of the people in the audience may be familiar, judging from the title, that this series was heavily inspired by my personal hero, James Lipton, and Inside the Actor's Studio. And it's his sort of tradition that at the end of each interview, he ends with a personal questionnaire that he presents to the interviewee. Obviously, this questionnaire has been modified to better match the subject. Felix, what is your favorite game?
I would say Xenoblade.
What is your least favorite game?
Oh boy, don't ask me that. Least favorite game? Yes, I know what will. Farmville. That one is pretty accurate.
I think there's a lot of people who may feel the same.
I mean, I worked on essentially a prototype, which is our task was create a game like Farmville, so I had to play it, and I actually realized how bad this game is, and how successful it is despite all of that. And it was kind of a little bit blowing my mind, like why. Okay, so
that's ancient Facebook. I think a lot of us were suckered into Farmville at some point in time. What game character do you love the most?
What game character I love the most? I really like the Valkyra from Valkyra Profile. Let's just say that. It's a really great character, I think.
Do you have thoughts about who your favorite game villain might be?
Can we maybe expand this to movies and other things?
Sure, yeah,
Because
that's no problem
then I
at
would
all.
know something, because some of the greatest villains I've experienced, I think, are in A Song of Ice and Fire, essentially. Because this game, this novel is just about so many people with different perspectives. So you don't actually have really true villains, and you have people in there that you generally hate, but not because they're just bad characters, just because they're still understandable, but you still hate them for what they're doing. But it still makes sense. So there's nothing that I hate more than villains. They're just there to be the bad guy, and they're kind of like behaving in a way to make you dislike them, even though that is not really rational for them. And what I have really respect for people who bring in an antagonist that you can respect, but you can still hate them. And those are kind of like the best antagonists, I think. And you don't find this a lot in video games. I'm a little bit disappointed in that regard. Like, a lot of video games go in this direction of you have this villain who tries to blow up things, tries to destroy the world, tries to reform the world. It's like a lot of, especially those. I have to say, I didn't play too many Western RPGs, which might be why I have this kind of perception. But a lot of JRPGs go this direction of villains that really which really go over the top in the end to an extent where it's hard to take them serious. And that's why I have issues actually renaming a very good villain right now.
No, that's fine. I think the best villain doesn't think they're the villain. They think they're the good guy.
Exactly. That is actually something that has been important to me from the very, very early on, that I just don't believe in the concept of good and evil. That's something you tell to a person that doesn't do what you like. That's the person you call evil. There might be some kind of things where you can agree that almost all people think that's good or evil, but still, it's just this whole thing that people are not good and they're not evil. People are just the different opinions and different point of views. And when those come into conflict, then they call each other good and evil. And that's something I actually noticed and what I realized really early on. And there was always this thing in my head that I never want to have the good and the bad guy in my story, just people with different opinions and sides of views.
Exactly. I mean, it's a very human way to write characters, I think. What inspires you and turns you on creatively?
What inspires me and turns me on creatively? Playing other games really is helping a lot to inspire yourself to create other games. In the end, that's kind of like the best inspiration you can get.
What is the converse? What turns off your creativity?
What turns off my creativity? I guess if you're just too busy with something and you just don't have any time to actually work on something, and then of course it's hard to be creative in this kind of context.
This one's a little bit easier. What is your favorite curse word?
Favorite curse word? Favorite curse word? Man, I don't curse a lot, I think. Maybe like stuff like what the heck, which isn't really a curse word, I would say.
The real gentleman comes behind from the fish with the top hat and the mustache here.
Yeah, I'm not even sure. I think I might actually curse. I just can't think of any particular curse word that is my favorite right now.
If you weren't in game development, what profession would you like to try?
Probably just software development. Probably related to the web somehow, because I really like web technologies.
What profession would you not like to try?
A lot of stuff that I probably couldn't imagine to do. Oh yeah, like stuff like being in marketing. I know I'm really bad at doing marketing. Really bad at kind of selling things to other people. I think the worst possible job would be kind of like where I have to phone people trying to sell them things.
And then lastly, if you had any advice to give to a game developer who is just starting out, what would it be?
I think keep things simple. Or I would say always try to think about the amount of work you want to put into the game and ask yourself if people will actually notice that. I think that's one of the most important facts you should consider in game development, trying to figure out if the effort you place in there is actually paying off. And I think that's not something you can just know. It's something you have to experience, which is why it's important to just try out things and try to get feedback. Whenever you work on something that is not noticed, it's essentially you spend a lot of time on something, you don't get anything in return. And that is, in the end, it's just puts the project on a higher risk. I mean, you can decide to create a very small and very polished game where a lot of the polishing actually won't even be noticed. Or you just try to create maybe a larger game which doesn't have all that much polishing, so you actually can focus on creating more content. But it's still polished enough so people will appreciate it. And I think this, in the end, might pay off more. So that's something I would suggest to people, kind of like pay attention to what kind of effort actually pays off.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Felix Klein. We're all going to be eager to see what version 1.0 will look like when it's all done.
Hopefully this year. Let's hope.
Thank you again, Felix.
Yeah, thanks a lot too.